Good afternoon. Welcome to the Preservation Association of Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name is Eileen Burkton. I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. Our lecture today is jointly sponsored, it's sponsored by the Preservation Association of Lincoln. And our brown bags are supported by your memberships in the Preservation Association of Lincoln, and we encourage you to join to support these activities. You can join by going online to preservelincoln.org. Our speaker today is Jim McKee. Jim is a lifelong Lincolnite. He is a founding member of the Preservation Association of Lincoln, and he's also served on the Historic Preservation Commission for many decades, and is currently on the Nebraska State Historical Society Board of Trustees. He's a unique Lincoln resource, and he also gives an incredible amount of time to helping letting us know our local history. Jim's talk today is titled Havelock. Please join me in welcoming Jim McKee.
We'll say unique is the best thing that's ever been said about me, okay? And I'll let it go. Well, as you can see, today's program is brought to you by Baker's Pharmacy in downtown Havelock. This is one of a number of slides that Dick Baker gave to me after they closed the pharmacy. He then went to work for a pharmacy within Lincoln General Hospital, which is called what, I don't know today, but in Lincoln General Hospital, and then retired to a Walgreens store in Phoenix. And when they cleaned out the old Baker hardware store in Havelock, they found a lot of things. One of the things they discovered was that his stepfather, Doc Baker, who had owned the pharmacy for almost all of its life, he had taken over from his brother who was killed in a boating accident. But when he closed the pharmacy ultimately, turned it over to Dick, and Dick left, they discovered in the basement that Doc Baker was kind of a unique person himself. He'd never thrown a thing away. I'm sure the women in the audience can relate to that, because husbands seemingly never throw anything away. But also, he had never put anything on sale. So when a new item came out to replace something, he put the old one in the basement. He didn't mark it down, he just put it in the basement. So one of the things they had on the closing of Baker Hardware was an auction. And one of our employees went to the auction, and he said at that auction, he could have bought many interesting things. He said there were several Morning Glory Victrolas, or whatever they called them, still in their original boxes. He said I could have bought a pair of high-button shoes, black or white, women's or men's, in any size, still in the original boxes. And he said, and on and on and on. So some of the things that Dick found were these slides, which they flashed on the screen at the Joyo Theater in between movies as advertisements. The other thing he found was something I had been looking for probably 35 years, and that was a picture of the Rock Island Depot in Omaha. We didn't have one. The Historical Society didn't have one. The Rock Island Museum did not have one. There just wasn't one. And when Dick cleaned things out, he came to me and he said, and I found this. I don't know whether you're interested or not. And of course it was a picture of the Rock Island Depot, which you'll see in a little while. And I quickly duplicated it, gave one to the Rock Island Depot, one to the State Historical Society, and anybody else that wanted one. So that's the story behind our opening slide. This is a picture of General Sir Henry Havelock. Never set foot in Havelock, the city, never set foot in Nebraska, never set foot in the United States. He does have a statue of himself in Trafalgar Square. And if you were to walk by, as I have done, and ask people in Trafalgar Square, Londoners, where the statue of Sir Henry Havelock is, you would be met with a blank stare. Basically, no one has ever heard of him. He comes to the United States with another man by the name of Mr. Tousland, Albert E. Tousland, who came to the United States at age 8. And when he arrived here, one of his boyhood heroes was General Sir Henry Havelock. Exactly why, I'm not sure. Havelock's main claim to fame was that he had saved his troops at the siege of Lucknow, mainly by holding out a few days till reinforcements came. That was his claim to fame. One of the things that Tousland gave to the Havelock Library was a book, a biography of Major General Sir Henry Havelock. And of course, that wound its way into the Lincoln City Library collection. And this is the frontispiece from that book. And he is going to get to name the city of Havelock, as we will see. In October of 1870, another village is platted. 1870, the village was Newton, Newton. Newton sat on approximately 1,000 acres. It was certainly over a section. And on July 4th of 1870, the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad had completed a line from Plattsmouth as far as Newton. They were hoping on July 4th to reach the city of Lincoln for festivities, and they would have, except there were no rails. So they got as far as Newton, and they had an excursion train that left Plattsmouth with flat cars in which they had somehow nailed benches and seats and bowers of trees above them, came into Newton, and at Newton they put them in buggies and brought them into Lincoln. The Burlington, Missouri River Railroad will not even get here until later that same month. I believe it was July the 26th of 1870. In the meantime, Newton sits there, and it is platted, and it would sit about today where Novartis Drug Company sits. That would be almost in the middle of it, because if we look at the plat, we see the Burlington, Missouri River Railroad cuts through the middle of it and on a slight diagonal. There was a depot there. It's what we'd call a whistle stop or a flag stop. In other words, if you wanted the train to stop, they would raise a flag and the train would stop and you could come into Lincoln. I doubt that it was probably used, if ever, but very infrequently. It is, we thought, for years, the beginning of the city of Havelock. It is not. Obviously, it's way to the east of Havelock, certainly way to the east of Havelock as it's going to exist in its early days. And we didn't discover that until I noticed that there's a mile marker on it that tells how far it is to Chicago. And that doesn't put it in Havelock. It puts it well outside of Havelock. In 1875, the legislature had a way of dissolving a plat which had never had a single lot sold in it. And that's what happened to Newton. It was simply dissolved. Not one single lot had ever been sold. The man that owned the village of Newton was a man by the name of R.E. Moore, who was a real estate magnate in the city of Lincoln. And if you have occasion to be in Lincoln General Hospital, you'll find one of the wings is named for R.E. Moore. That's because he put up 1/3 of the money to build the original Lincoln General Hospital. 1/3 of it. So he got a wing named after him. But Newton went away. I always thought it was probably named after the cookie anyway. Didn't make any difference. It turns out that literally every state in the Union has a Newton, which simply means new town. Well, that new town did not take. It was still a whistle stop clear up until 1890 of Major General Sir Henry Havelock's statue in Trafalgar Square. In one of the two pictures, I'm on the bottom in front of the plinth, and on top is a pigeon standing on his head. And I'm not sure which one we have because there's a light shining someplace directly in the wrong place. Well, the thing that got Havelock itself going was Albert E. Tousland, A.E. Tousland, who at that time lived in Omaha, vice president of the railroad, a man by the name of John McFarland, who lived about 2 blocks from where we're sitting right now. He lived at the northwest corner of 14th and Q in a huge house, which was later a hospital, along with a man by the name of John Clark. They had obtained land which ran today roughly from 48th Street to 70th Street, from Adams Street to Salt Creek, a huge amount of land. They had bought that land as agents for the railroad, but for their own portfolios. These 3 gentlemen were all land agents for the Burlington, Missouri River Railroad, which means that they would plot and plat where exactly the railroad went and where a railroad station would be built approximately every 7 to 10 miles along the route of the railroad. They were all rather wealthy. And Mr. Phillips was another land agent. His house is at 18th and D, the Phillips Castle. He didn't figure into the city of Havelock, however. So they bought this land, and the first thing they did was they offered a central piece of the land, about 300 acres, to the Burlington, Missouri River Railroad if they would establish there a railroad shops. Now, there was already a shop in Plattsmouth where they had crossed the river, a major Burlington shop, of course. and they didn't need one this close to Plattsmouth. But Mr. McFarland, Mr. Touslin, and Mr. Clark were all vice presidents of the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad. So when they made the offer, they had a little bit of clout behind them, and the railroad will accept it. And here you'll see they begin building their 300 acres of the 2,000 acres, over 2,000 that the combine owned. Now, the idea would be, the reason they offered to give them the land was just like in the village of Bethany Heights, where that community offered a university a number of acres of land if they would build a university there. The same thing is true in University Place, where they were offered about 44 acres of land if they would build a university, and also in College View, where they were offered around 40 acres of land if someone would build a university. The idea being that if a university was built, people would come, faculty would come, support people would come, and a community would develop around the university, and suddenly the land which they had given away would cause the land which they hadn't given away to be worth many, many times over what they had paid for it. And it certainly did work in University Place, College View, and to a lesser extent the village of Bethany Heights. So this was their idea. Not a university, excuse me, but rather a railroad shops. And they hoped for a community to form around it. So in 1890, the old plat of Newton is dissolved and the new plat of Havelock is established. And one of the first things they do is they go out to Newton and pick up the depot and move it into the area we now call Havelock. It would have set, if you know where the present Burlington sort of depot is, kind of a Balin building, it sat probably about a block and a half to 2 blocks to the northeast of the present depot building. So this is the beginning of the building. They start to build almost immediately. The engine Wahoo comes through in 1870, then followed by others, of course, as the city of Lincoln begins to develop and draws people through the area. This picture is taken sometime, probably June or July of 1890, when the first building was built at the shops, 400 feet long by 130 feet wide. The interesting thing about the buildings at the Havelock shops, the interesting thing is that virtually every building they have ever built is still there, even just the tiny little buildings. Almost all of them have changed their function through the years, but virtually every single one of them is still there. As soon as the building was completed, about 40 men began working here on 3 damaged railroad engines, locomotives. At that point in time, by the end of the year, their annual payroll had reached $275,000. So 40 men had expanded. This is the building almost completed. By 1895, they had 400 men on the payroll and a $17,000 per month payroll. 1910, roughly the height, not quite the height, they had 800 men on the payroll and a $2 million annual payroll. At that point in time, about 1910, they will do a $1 million renovation, and shortly afterwards they will add the first major smokestack, which also had a steam whistle on it, which you could hear all over the city of Lincoln. I grew up on South Cotner Boulevard, and we could hear the 8 o'clock whistle, for example, at our house. And it was for that purpose it was put in, to let the people within the community know when the men were supposed to be to work, when lunch hour was, and when they were done for the day. This is one of many pictures. I won't bore you with very many of them. This is the foundry, taken a shortly time later, about 1900, something like this. The office of the railroad was, by virtue of the fact that they had the money, probably the most up-to-date business office within Lincoln, or within Havelock, certainly. You'll notice that they have electric lights, they have telephones. These telephones would probably have been more for communication within the company rather than into the outside community. Pretty soon we're building locomotives at Havelock, and if you've never seen one of them that was built in Havelock, in fact you probably have, even though you don't realize it, because the engine that is in Iron Horse Park directly to the north of the downtown depot was made in Havelock. It was restored elsewhere, but was made in Havelock. This is the second depot. It's gone now too. I think this is the one that was on the postcard that went out, looking towards Omaha, towards the northeast. On the platform is Jimmy Young. We'll see him again in a minute. He was a a dwarf, I believe, and he was in charge of the newspaper routes in Havelock. My father later worked for him. He had a little bit different system than newspaper boys had within the city of Lincoln, and that is if you had a subscription, you bought it from Jimmy, or Eddie, excuse me. Eddie, Jimmy was in Bethany, different guy, so Eddie. And Eddie then was in charge of collecting too. So the newspaper boy, all he did was deliver the newspapers. And he had the franchise for not just the Lincoln newspapers, but also the Omaha World Herald. So you could get any sort of newspaper you wanted from Eddie. And he's standing there on the platform. An aerial view of the shops sometime later, but it shows you how the 300 acres sits, right, just to the north of the city and just to the west of 70th Street as well. Occupied a great deal of land there. It hasn't changed much in its general configuration. The buildings have changed. With World War I, all the railroads in the United States were nationalized. In other words, the federal government took over the railroads to move materials and supplies and men during World War I. Then after World War I, the railroads were given back to their respective owners. And when this happened, the federal government established what was known as the National Railroad Labor Board. And the purpose of this board was to reorganize or to actually move down the wages of the railroad workers. During World War I, they had risen to a much higher level than the general populace. So the federal government wanted, by 1921, to lower the wages of the railroad workers by 12% and have no provision for overtime. You can imagine this was extremely popular with the railroad workers. And almost at the same time, in May, there was a coal strike in the United States, particularly in the coal regions of Virginia. This is going to be tough to come out of, because if you cut off coal and the railroads, you literally cut off all the distribution of supplies, groceries, everything, lumber, anything you can think of will stop moving. So at that point in time, many things are going to happen. There will be the union's reply to this strike, and this happens to be a telegram sent to my grandfather, who was the shop steward, or the shop foreman, I guess you would say, telling him or authorizing him June 28th, 1922, to take the 903 men then working at the shops out on strike. In effect, there were two unions there, and I'm not clear exactly how it divided up, but it authorized him to do that. This, at the same time, took 400,000 men out on strike across the United States, and a total of 3,600 in the state of Nebraska. This is a massive strike. And in fact, it is so massive that a restraining order goes out to prevent the strike from going on July 20th. It was completely ignored by the union. The railroad came along itself, the Burlington, which is how I'll refer to it rather than the Burlington and Missouri Railroad, or as its name changes through the years. I'll just call it the Burlington for ease from here on. The railroad says, either you go back to work, guys, or we're going to close the Havelock shops completely and move all of those jobs to the city of Denver. Then in August, President of the United States, President Harding, considers renationalizing the railroads and making them federal again. The governor of the state of Nebraska at that time was Sam McKee, and he said that he would use the National Guard, if necessary, to go in and operate the railroad. Now, I was in the National Guard a little bit later on, and I can picture what would happen if the National Guard had tried to take over the railroads. We didn't know anything about railroads, I assured you. Well, now comes a series of events, all leading to the same conclusion. This is one of the two major unions, the Boilermakers, as they line up to leave work. This is a photograph taken as they're informing the men that they are to go out on strike. The Boilermakers will walk to their union, which is at about 64th and Havelock Avenue today. There's a little bank in there today. The rest of them will go to the other union headquarters, which is the Lancaster Building. We'll see a picture of it in just a second. Well, now comes a series of pushes and shoves by both the union and the railroad, where, the railroad makes threats, the union ignores them. The railroad will send people in from the home office in Minnesota to tell the men to go back to work because they explain, or they attempt to explain to these men, that they have gone out on strike against the railroad for something that the federal government is responsible for. The federal government is the one that is forcing them to lower their wages. So they're striking someone that has no ability to do what the union wants them to do, to reinstate wages. So it becomes a push and a shove. And at one point in time, some of the men start going back to work. My grandfather, because he was one of the union leaders, stayed out on strike and in fact moved briefly to Canada and went to work on a farm so that he could send money home to keep his family going. But as this strike progressed, day after day, week after week, it began to greatly impact the city of Havelock, because at that point, virtually everybody that lived in Havelock was in one way or another dependent upon the railroads. If you were a grocer, you may not be directly dependent on the railroads, but you would be dependent upon the business of the people who worked for the railroads. And if they couldn't pay you, the grocer would, over time, reach the end of where he can offer credit. So it was beginning to impact every business in the community. The other thing that we don't think about was the churches. And several of them began to, unfortunately, just have to close, like the Congregational Church. Some of them hung on, but basically the churches were also in a great deal of trouble. I thought it was interesting, too, that the newspapers did not take the side of the union or the railroad. And they seemed to favor the railroad a little bit, but never really did come out and say, get back to work, guys. And in fact, one of the newspaper reports, I think it was a Havelock Post, said that 750 of the 903 men were back to work. This wasn't true exactly. Some of them may have been back to work, but they weren't back to work for the railroad. Some of them had gone to work for other railroads. Some of them had retired. Some of them had moved out of Havelock and taken other jobs elsewhere. So we have an impasse at this point in time. What ultimately happens is the strike never ends. And technically, and I've never been able to exactly pin this down, but technically we're told that that strike is still an open strike. It's never been closed. Now obviously, most of the men went back to work. My grandfather went back to work. Ultimately, when he came back from Canada, the railroad issued one of its many threats, and they said to him specifically, and I'm sure others at the same time, if you will come back to work by date certain, you will not lose any seniority. Well, in the meantime, what had happened is the national headquarters of the union had told their men, go back to work, guys. In fact, we're striking the wrong group. The group in Havelock either never got the message or felt they had a stronger position for reasons unknown to me. They stayed out on strike. And ultimately, my grandfather was coerced by the other union people in Omaha not to go back on date certain. And that was, I believe, a Friday. Finally, over the weekend, I think my grandmother thumped him alongside of the head, and on Monday, he went back to work, having lost all of his seniority. He went back and started at the very bottom and worked again until his retirement in the late 1950s. So, in the meantime, the railroad has changed considerably. 1931, the functions of the shops out there were beginning to change. They were no longer building steam locomotives. They were primarily involved in repairing them. 1942, the Galesburg, Illinois shop closed. They moved all that to Havelock. 1955, they started building railroad cars as well. By 1960, they had come back up to 700 employees, not quite the 900 and some they had before. 1967, the Plattsmouth shop is closed, and that's moved to Havelock as well. There were two railroads in Havelock. The Burlington was the one with the power. The other major railroad was the Chicago Rock Island Pacific, which gave the city of Lincoln and Havelock connections to Omaha and to Colorado Springs. They were the last major railroad to come to the city of Lincoln, and of course their depot down at about 21st, 22nd, I guess 23rd and O, something like that, is still there and currently a bank. But in 1892, they came through. And they did this there was no land in the city anymore to be given to them by railroads, by the state or the city. So what they had to do was they paralleled the Burlington Railroad until they entered the city proper, at which point they started buying lots for the railroad line. And if you would look down on a map of the Rock Island in Lincoln, you would see it follows this sort of a course. It's not a straight line. And that's because sometimes they were able to buy lots and sometimes they weren't. If it were empty lots, they had no problem. So sometimes you'll find that the railroad tracks are on the extreme east edge of a property, sometimes on the extreme west edge of a property, sometimes right through the middle, and they'll own 2 lots on each side of it. And it won't come out and be a straight line again approximately until the railroad goes under Sheridan Boulevard and starts going in a straight line at about Calvert Street. Then it goes in a straight line, and you'll remember it goes beyond the city and goes through that terrible tunnel on Highway 2, which now has a bridge over the top of it. Rock Island, 1966 in October, ran their last passenger train through the city of Lincoln. 1968, they sold the depot, and it became first a bank, and then other banks have subsequently been located there. Then in 1981, the railroad was bankrupt and no longer ran at all. This is a picture of the depot in Havelock. It was on the Rock Island tracks, which were in effect towards the south edge of Havelock on Tuesland. The depot sat facing to the south, and it was about a half to 3/4 of a block to the east of present Tuesland Avenue. Back of me, on the other side of Tuesland Avenue, there was a large grain elevator, which we also have pictures of, but I didn't bring for you today. This is the Lancaster Building, now on the National Register. It is the building which was built in 1892, 1893 by the Woods brothers because they acquired most of the unsold property which had belonged to the Lincoln or the Lancaster Land Company, which was Mr. Tuesland, Mr. Clark, and Mr. McFarland. They, at that point, sold off the undeveloped land, and the Woods brothers began to develop Havelock. And they bought land in addition to Havelock. So where Norwood Park sits today, they added that as a subdivision adjacent to Havelock. The city of Havelock was incorporated May the 6th of 1893. And the Woods brothers built this building partially to show their confidence in the village, and of course it's still there. Still occupied. It looks better than this now, but it has been completely renovated by the Rockabys. Originally, there was a grocery store in that building. This is maybe not the original ownership. The lady on the right is Mrs. Stanley. Her son, Cecil Stanley, will become the director of Nebraska Department of Education later on. Directly behind this building will be Dr. Ballard's house. We'll hear about him in just a second. When I was a kid, this was also still a grocery. It was Tom's Grocery. No longer a grocery. Long time since it's been a grocery store. This is the corner which now houses the Joyo Theater. This is the corner. In fact, the taller lady just to the right of the telephone pole is my grandmother. The lady next to her is my great aunt. The building behind them was owned by my great-grandfather, who was the first postmaster of Havelock. And this was where the post office was in this building originally. The post office was there along with his other business, which was a barber shop, and also another business which was a dry goods store, which he called the Havelock. Pretty clever. Okay. One of the first two, maybe the first, but one of the first two commercial buildings built in the city of Havelock. The Joyo sits there now. The other building was directly across the street to the south, which was the W.R. Johnson Hardware Company. And the present building on that corner, the brick building, was a subsequent building of the Johnson Hardware Company. We're looking down Havelock Avenue in this picture towards the east. And at one time, my uncle told me that the family lived above this store as well. A little bit later picture, and maybe a couple of these are turned around a little bit. Here, Baker's Pharmacy has moved into that building. And in the meantime, the double brick building, which is built in 2 stages, a couple of doors to the right or to the east, was built, and this becomes the second post office in the city of Havelock. That building is still there. I'm not sure what's in it today. There was a refrigeration company, and for a while, La Paloma Restaurant was in there. Some of you may remember. But Baker Hardware is in here at this point in time. Baker is later going to move up to a brick building a little bit later on. And that building, the Havelock building, will be picked up and moved one block to the east. And if you know where, this would be just to the north of the northeast corner of 62nd and Havelock Avenue. On the corner, I think, is now a furniture store. So this was pushed back, built there, or rebuilt there, it's left there, apartment above and a cabinet maker below. The city of Lincoln, after it becomes Havelock, will tear this building down for a parking lot. Whenever I pause, it means parking lot. Okay. So this becomes another one of Lincoln's parking lots. Another picture from the same location looking towards the east on Havelock Avenue. My great aunt again in the middle of the picture. Unclear to me whether it's Lena or Lottie, though, from the back. My great aunts had great names, Lena, Lottie, and Laura. So our daughter is named Laura for Laura, which was, I told her, don't get smart with me, because we could have named you Lena or Lottie. But I'm not sure which one it is from the back. Lena or Lottie. She's looking at the trolley system, which is going to connect the city of Havelock with the city of Lincoln. The streetcar franchise was originally granted in 1887, but it was completely ignored. Nobody was interested in building a trolley car to the city of Havelock. There was no need for it. Because at the heights between the railroads that ran through there, there was a train going through Havelock one way or the other about every 10 minutes a day. Every 10 minutes, 24 hours a day. Which meant that if you wanted to go downtown to Lincoln, you could again, if it wasn't a passenger train that was stopping, you could flag it or whistle it and it would stop and you could go downtown for a handful of cents, really. If it was a freight train, you could still stop it and ride in the caboose. So they didn't need a trolley car, which would have taken about twice as long to get downtown. However, that was in 1887, and they abandoned the franchise. In 1898, during that period, the city of Havelock decides they want to become more genteel. They don't want to ride in the caboose of a freight train. They want to be able to ride on one of them fancy new trolleys to the city of Lincoln, which is actually going to take them 20 minutes at least to get to Lincoln. So it's much extended. But nonetheless, it gives them the advantage of being able to take the trolley and go to Nebraska Wesleyan University Place and downtown. And of course, that means on a Saturday, they can get on the trolley a little bit later on in Havelock, and they'll have to pay an extra penny when they get to University Place to get to Lincoln. Then in Lincoln, they can transfer trains. They can go out on the trolley car to College View. And they'll have to pay an extra penny when they get to the bridge over on Sheridan Boulevard right there too. But for 7 cents, you can have a great trip out to University Place and there, College View. There you can stop a little man who had a roasted peanut stand, get a sack of peanuts for a nickel, and for another 7 cents you can go back to Havelock. A great Sunday afternoon's outing. Great. So that's what they wanted. They wanted that. Well, interestingly enough, when they applied to the Railway Commission to have that reinstated, the trolley car line reinstated, it was met with considerable vocal opposition, entirely from the city of University Place. They did not want to be connected to Havelock. Now, the physical distance between Havelock and University Place was probably about 100 feet, maybe 120, because it was Adams Street. If you lived on the south side of Adams Street, you lived in either Bethany or University Place. If you lived on the north side of Adams Street, you lived in Havelock. And my uncle pointed out that there just as well have been a barbed wire fence down the middle of Adams Street, because they didn't mix much. And my uncle said if he were to be seen walking to school with a young lady from the other side of Adams, her brothers would have killed him. Okay? At any rate, there was not a great deal of friendliness. Part of that was because those rascals over in University Place and Nebraska Wesleyan were almost 100% Methodists. Yeah. Now, it was the Methodists that did not want a trolley car to run to Havelock, because in Havelock they had saloons. And they were greatly in fear of the students from Nebraska Wesleyan getting on that trolley car and going over to Havelock. Well, a lot of the parents in Havelock were pretty suspicious themselves, because their impressionable youth could get on that same trolley car and go to University Place, where they had churches. You know. Now, where can you get into more trouble? I don't know. Sometimes you got to wonder. But at any rate, the people in Havelock really wanted the trolley car, and the people in University Place really didn't. So at one point, the business community in Havelock approached the business community in University Place and said, look, let this go through, because if you don't, we are going to license a saloon on the extreme south edge of Havelock. Now remember, that's 120 feet roughly from the edge of University Place. Would have been along about where later the Bluebird was located. And Bluebird was ostensibly a roller skating rink on Tuzlan Avenue on the east side. Not too far from where the fire station is today, maybe a little north of that. Well, they were unaffected in University Place. They fought it anyway. They were willing to fight it anyway, even with the possibility of a saloon being built that close. So the Havelock businessmen called another meeting, and they said, look, we're going to play our last card. If you don't let us build that trolley car, not only are we going to build a saloon on the south edge of Havelock, we are going to build a motion picture theater house. That did it. Wesleyan capitulated, and University Place capitulated, and allowed, they removed their objection, and the tracks were laid. As soon as the tracks were laid, and as soon as they started trying to run trolley cars along it, the businessmen, we think, in University Place, dynamited the bridge. They rebuilt the bridge. And the next thing they did was they greased the tracks so that even with a slight rise, they couldn't get there. But slowly through time, it was ignored, and the trolley car ran. And pretty soon you'll find, too, that the communities begin to get closer to each other in every respect, physically and philosophically. And my father said when he was in high school, this would probably have been in the 20s, I suppose, he said that Havelock High School, if they wanted a track team, they had to borrow Clint Schwartz from University Place. And if they wanted a basketball team, they had to borrow one of the Schumann twins from Bethany. So the kids began to get together at some point in time. Well, by 1890, there were also two newspapers in the city of Havelock. There was the Times, which was a Democrat newspaper, which had a circulation of 1,400. There was also the Post, which was an independent newspaper, which had a circulation of 1,440. So there was evidently more independents than there were Democrats. And you'll notice there was no Republican newspaper there. By 1899, they also had a telephone exchange. And that telephone exchange building would be on what's today Ballard Street, pretty much directly to the south and a little bit to the west of the bank corner, somewhere's in there. 1907, they also had their own gas works where they manufactured producer gas and had an electric light plant. 1913, they noted they had two banks and several hotels. The business is going very well there. By 1920, they advertised something which makes no sense at all. They said we were the second largest community in Lancaster County. Well, doesn't take much. Although it did mean they were much bigger than Bethany, College View, or University Place. That didn't mean too much. So the trolley car did not come down Tuzlan, as a lot of people reckon it did. It came down over in front of where the Goodyear plant is today on 56th. Turned to the east on Havelock Avenue, went on Havelock Avenue up to the corner where today Misty's is. It turned a half a block to the right or to the south. Then it turned to the east and ran down an alley, which would today be between Havelock Park and businesses on Havelock Avenue. And there was a loading dock, because in the morning, before the passenger trains came along, they ran light rail along there where they would take lumber or vegetables or whatever out to the businessmen. That trolley car line then went half a block further, and it turned then left or to the west on Havelock Avenue, and so it made a loop and then went back downtown. Now, in subsequent years, that loop will be extended and it will be moved out to 70th Street. And when I was a kid, the trolley cars left and the buses turned around there. And I can still remember very clearly, we'd walk from my grandmother's house and we would catch the bus, and he would make a loop there and go back down Havelock Avenue. Today, that southwest corner has a convenience store on it, located directly across the street from another convenience store, but that's where the turnaround was ultimately. This is a subsequent view. This is the second W.R. Johnson Hardware Company, so we're on the south side of Havelock Avenue. This is now Havelock, I think, Furniture Company is in there. I'm looking to you to correct me here. Is it Havelock Furniture? It's right there, I think, isn't it? Then right next to him is a building which appears to be very dark. It's actually a light-colored stone building, which was the Farmers and Mechanics Bank, one of the two banks in Havelock. Next to it, the little frame building with the pitched roof is a barber shop. Next to them is, and if I were wearing a hat, I would take it off now because that's where Arnold's is. Okay. And next door to it, we'll see in a minute, is the original Choyo Theater building. This picture is about 1910, something like that. And sometime after that, quite a while after that, probably into the 20s, the little frame building is torn down and a tiny little cement block building is put in there, not much wider than this. In fact, my father said that there was a counter along one side, and behind the counter was the grill for a little hamburger stand. And that's all there was, just that tiny little building. And it later became a barber shop too. Now this is a building which is now a parking lot directly to the west of the bank building on the south side of the street there. The man in the middle of the picture is my great-grandfather on the other side. His name is James Buchanan Hedrick, and his name is up at the top. James Buchanan Hedrick was a contractor builder. He built almost all of the buildings on the main street and virtually all of the houses. He did not build all of the houses, of course. Some of those houses were moved from the village of West Lincoln, which was a bustling community for less than 10 years. When they ran out of water, they started moving the houses out of West Lincoln by the hundreds, and many of those houses were brought into Havelock. My grandfather, or great-grandfather, also built, there's a lot of, and we'll see a picture of them in a minute, tiny little houses which were perfectly square, which were called workmen's cottages. And I asked my uncle, who worked for my great-grandfather for a while, now, I don't think any of them haven't been added on to. I said, but how did you come, you didn't have an architect? And he said, nope, Grandpa Hedrick would just simply accumulate lumber. And then when he had enough lumber, he would just make a house out of it. You know, who needs an architect? Yeah, all right. But this building he built for his sons. Now his sons also have good names. There's Alney, Volney, Roy, and Will. Okay. We don't know which ones they are, but I think it's probably Volney and Alney are sitting down there, maybe Alney, Volney, and Roy. They were going to live upstairs and have an adventure and have a pool hall on the ground floor. It lasted for a long time. The building did, at least. Gone now. 1955, the building was torn down. That's our friend Eddie Young again. This is a point in time when they decided they wanted to pave the main street, which through the years has had a number of names. Probably at this time it was still known as O Street. I'm not sure exactly when the petition was, but in about 1912, they renamed the streets in Havelock to be the same as the streets in Lincoln, so the main street was O Street. And they actually went from A to Q. That's when the railroad started going from north to south. And the streets were numbered from roughly 1, which was 48th Street. Nothing was precise. But at any rate, they wanted to pave O Street, Havelock Avenue, Jackson, depending on what point in time you want to look at it. And what they did was they got Eddie in a rowboat out in the street to show as if it were navigable. And they then copied this picture and fastened it to the top of their petition drive and circulated it. And sure enough, they got enough votes to have Havelock Avenue paved. On the right-hand building, the taller building, is the Lancaster. On the left, the building with the awning which comes out to the sidewalk is still there also. It is the Vicarage. It has a false brick front on it, but that building is very much still intact. Stepping back a little bit, the two-story brick building right there is the Masonic Temple, which still stands, clay. And next to it is an infill building, which is not there at this point in time, but it will later be the City Hall. And then the fire engine house, the engine house, which is today the Engine House Cafe. The Times, one of the two newspapers, will be torn down to build that beautiful cement block building, which is a laundry today. The engine house does not have its cupola on it, or where they would pull the hoses up, and also there would have been a bell up there at one point in time, probably to summon the volunteer fire department. And I've been lobbying to get them to put that back. We actually have some line drawings from, I think Mr. Tyler was the architect for this. Our old friends, the stonemason and architects of Tylers, apparently are the same Tylers that did this building. There were churches. I maybe maligned the churches a little bit. This is the Christian church. It would be where Mahoney Manor stands today. And as a kid, I always thought it looked like a cookie cutter had been assembled on the top of a building. The interior of the building was an octagon, as my father tells me, even with the balcony that went around it. An interesting building. And they will later locate clear over on the south edge of Havelock and still exist today. This is the Congregational Church, one of the churches which will go under during the strike and the depression which ensued. This church is still there. This is the Lutheran Church, which stands on the northwest corner of 70th and what would be the 1st Street north of Havelock Avenue. Is that Platt or Morrill? Platt. Okay, so Platt. They've added a small appurtenance onto the front of this building, so other than that, it looks exactly like it does today. The other church, which is still in existence, of course, the Methodist and the Catholic churches. No pictures. School. The first school in Havelock was taught in a storefront on Jackson Avenue, O Street, Havelock Avenue. And that happened a lot in small towns. They would simply hold school there temporarily while they start thinking about a building. The first regular school here on Morrill between 62nd and 63rd Street. You can see it here. And then it'll be followed by 1617, they'll begin to build the new high school building, which still stands, of course, as now the Goodyear Recreation Center. This picture taken in 1930. You can still see the old building to the right or to the north of it. 1921, Norwood Park School was built, and of course, it started in a house for a while, and the house was it's still there, about 2 blocks to the west of 70th Street on the southeast corner of about 68th and Platt. I'm not sure that's the exact address, but it still stands. Then Norwood Park is going to be built. Then 1916, they get a $35,000 bond issue together to build this building, which will be 6224 Logan on the backside of that block. It's completed in 1920. This is about the time in the teens and 1920 when the city of Lincoln first begins to covet the city of Havelock. They would like to annex it. The reason they want to annex it is because primarily of the tax base. By this time we have, and we'll see in a minute, that we have some heavy industry going on there in addition to the Burlington shops. And one of the things this did was it meant that the city of Havelock is going to have the best school budget per capita of literally anything in the state, and one of the highest in the United States per capita tax base. So Lincoln would like to have Havelock. Havelock did not need Lincoln and was completely uninterested. But this is the first time Havelock begins to look. And in fact, as this Havelock High School begins to develop, it will have things before Lincoln High School has them. Things like, but not necessarily including, things like a metal shop, a wood shop, a cooking class, a chemistry laboratory, a physics laboratory, and so forth. Some of those things they will have before Lincoln does because of that excellent tax base. And by the way, I should stop right there and tell you that when the original building was torn down, the stones were saved and ultimately used in another building which still stands today, which was built probably in the 30s, and it was built to house a beer wholesaler. They wanted to just store beer in it. So the building was built more or less as a cube, and it's a double-walled cube. So it has stone, an air gap, and stone, because it's going to be like a big refrigerator. And no windows, and just doors to accommodate loading in and out beer trucks. Unfortunately, what they didn't count on, they went ahead and built the building, and they didn't realize that they needed a liquor license to store beer, which they couldn't get. In fact, even though they were outside the city of Lincoln, Lincoln controlled out that far with the liquor licenses. So the building was used to store fertilizer, farm implements, stuff like that over the years until 1949 when a man by the name of Vermoss, who had a filling station at 14th and Q here in Lincoln, a Scala station, decided that, like everybody has decided maybe at one point in their lives, I could run a restaurant. Anybody can do that. Well, Earl thought I could run a restaurant. Although he knew he didn't know everything to know about a restaurant, he sought out a man who did to become his partner. So they put together this building. They took this double-walled stone building, this cube, and turned it into a restaurant. Got it all ready to go. And about the time they're almost ready to open, his partner goes on vacation and never comes back, which leaves him to open the restaurant in 1949. He did, and it's still there. I ate lunch yesterday. It's the steakhouse. So if you don't remember the stones from that original building, you can go out and visit them, and you'll notice today it has no windows. The other thing is, you would think that it would be very easy to say air condition or heat because of this captive air, but they tell me it makes it very difficult to heat and air condition, and I don't know why. But there's a chance to go back and visit. Now, every year, the Havelock community, the businessmen particularly, would throw a carnival, and this carnival was for the people of Havelock, but also, more than that, it was for the farmers and the people who lived in the surrounding area to thank for them for patronizing the businesses within the city. They would hold this usually in August, okay? And this was the 1908 Farmers Fair. It was kind of a harvest fair as well. Well, this one was August the 22nd of 08. You can see it along the bottom. And they call it a gala day. Pretty heady language, a gala day. And this one is looking, you can see the tower of the fire department over there, and it is a demonstration of the hand pumper. And what they did was they would have like a ball on a wire, and then they would have two teams of pumpers. They would both throw a stream of water at that ball, try to move it over into the other side, and that would count a point somehow. I'm not sure exactly. And in fact, the Havelock Fire Department men won a competition in New Orleans. I've got one of their little badges. This would be, I think this would be 62nd or 63rd. We're looking towards the north. That's the Lancaster on the right, and the vicarage right there. Is that 63rd or 62nd? 62nd. See, I have my brains are over here. Okay. The little peaked roof building over here will be where the bank is going to be built later on. The two-story building on the left is the vicarage. The right is the Lancaster, the building. In the middle of the intersection, you begin to see here how many people come in for this gala or fair. There's a trapeze set up down there, and the people are getting just about ready to see some sort of trapeze demonstration. Now we're back down to, this would be 61st, and here we can see the W.R. Johnson Hardware Company. We can see a better view of the Farmers and Mechanics Bank building and the little barber shop, the two-story Arnold's. And to the left of that, the original Joyo Theater building. And in this picture, we can see just at the corner of the building there, if you look to the second floor, you can see a man standing on the right and a woman seated on the left. It's a ladder that's balanced on top of another ladder or something. We're not sure what. So this is another one of those sort of gymnastic feats. And again, look how many people there are. Hundreds and hundreds. This is my favorite, and we'll just barely have time to do this one, I think. This is taken looking towards the southeast. The library, you can see over there, which sat in the north edge of Havelock Park. On the left is my great-grandfather's Holiet House Hotel. The little two-story building on the right would be the parking lot today for Misty's. And the first time I saw this picture, first of all, I realized Havelock was up to date. We had a two-holder. That's the city two-holder. And also, a lot of people are gathered up here in what was an empty lot, and they have formed a square around something there. You can see them quite clearly. What on earth, I thought, were they watching? Well, it turns out, I don't know why they weren't standing in that grass, but they weren't paying any attention at all to that square. They were looking, actually, if you can look at the people, you'll see they're all looking towards the east. I'm going to step away from the microphone and point to something, which you may be able to hear me. There's a telephone pole here, and back on top of the Holiet House, there's a pyramid of lumber. And connecting that pyramid with the telephone pole is a wire. And right here on the wire is a young lady who, in her teeth, has a pulley. And she is riding that wire from the Holiet House down here in an experiment to see what happens when she gets to the telephone pole. Yeah. And I've often said that I think this demonstration was probably sponsored by Dr. Webster, who was the dentist. I don't know. This is a feat that carnivals had all over the place. That was this riding down a wire. I've gotten the 5-minute warning sign up there, so if somebody knows where those lights are, we'll turn them on and see if there are any questions. I do think we will have enough for a subsequent program to take up the second half, which will be the commercial history of the city of Havelock. Okay, so if there are any questions, I will try to see your hands. If we can get the lights up, I'll have a better opportunity to do that. There we go. Any questions at all? Quick, poke Matt, so it looks like he's awake.
Once again, the founding date.
1893, it's incorporation. Yeah, and my great-grandfather probably arrived about 1890, something like that. And of course, the Burlington really came in 1870 and began building shortly after that.
So there were residents and some businesses probably associated with the shop at the time.
Yeah, very, very small ones, obviously. Yeah, and I've got those dates. And if you're interested in more details, this you can get in the gift shop. Ed Zimmer and I wrote this history of Havelock. Doesn't answer all your questions, but Chris has got them over in the gift shop if you want to know even more. And there's my great-grandfather's pictures, my uncle pictures. Well, actually, it comes around. And I've got 2 of those yard-longs. This is at the point when there were around 900 men in the shops. But I haven't been able to figure out which one is him. Another question? Yeah?
Although at one time it was the second largest settlement in Lancaster County, is it the second oldest settlement as well?
Yeah. I had to stop and think. Well, actually, Yankee Hill, which is not part of Lincoln yet, would precede it. Yankee Hill would probably precede Lincoln. But yeah, because the others were roughly in the period 1887, 1888, 1890. The major suburbs, Havelock, University Place, and College View, and Normal. All 3 of those, all 4 of those, pretty much at the same time. When Havelock did join, and that'll be part of our story next time, in 1930, when they were annexed by the city of Lincoln, their population was around 3,633. I guess it wasn't around that, it was. A question behind Bob, yeah.
Did Mr. Tusland and his cohorts live in Havelock?
No. Mr. McFarland lived on the northwest corner of 14th and Q. There's now, the university owns the property now. It's part of the University of Nebraska graduate studies program. I'm not sure what's in there. And on the corner is Wendy's. And that whole quarter of a block was where Mr. McFarland lived. He lived in Lincoln, but Mr. Tusland lived in Omaha. Mr. Clark lived in Lincoln sometimes, but not in Havelock. Another question? Yeah?
You said that the street was paved at a date in there. Didn't they have a brick street to begin with?
Well, when it was paved, it was probably brick. would be paved, but not with asphalt or macadam. All the early streets in Lincoln, after we got wise to the fact that we couldn't pave them with cedar blocks, brick was really the choice. And in fact, if you look at a lot of the streets today, go look at Dudley Street, for example. It's still brick and it's still great. They are tearing up the brick little by little, and some of the things that brick was really good for was a base. Sheridan Boulevard had a base of brick under it until they just now are tearing out the brick. So brick was the first paving material. Concrete and macadam asphalt, that stuff comes on a little later. Is there a question back there? Someplace I can't really see out there very well. Okay, thank you very much, and keep peeled. We will have a second half, I think.